things like conflict minerals. So really keep an eye on that. Obviously the information will come through by email, you'll see posted on campus, and obviously make every attempt to try and attend. So I just want to begin today's proceedings with a few thank yous. Firstly to someone who's not here, but she's been instrumental in engaging with the master's students who've organised the festival as a whole, which is Caroline Carsey, who probably without which we wouldn't, well, we certainly wouldn't be sat in this room. So she's not here, but a big thank you to her anyway. If you ever come in contact with her, she's a really a great member of the admin staff and a credit to Kingston. So thanks, Caroline, even though you're not here. But also a big thank you to the master's students and some undergrad students as well who've been involved in organising the festival this year. One of the great things about Kingston, from my point of view as a lecturer, but also as a student, because I'm doing my PhD here, is the kind of wealth of knowledge and the passion and the contacts that you have. And I think the diversity in the festival this year has borne that out. So thanks a lot to all the master's students and undergrad students that have been involved this year. It's really great. It wouldn't be able to happen every year if it wasn't without your engagement. Okay, so moving on to the topic in hand. I just want to start with something that initially might not necessarily seem to have much connect initially with the events in Iraq over the last 10 years, and that's kind of one of my observations with relation to teaching. Now when I go home at night, and I've been teaching all day, I don't, as much as you students might imagine, just go into a box where I have a life and I process things in the way you do. So I think about my teaching in the way that you think about the seminars I've been to. And one of the great things about teaching, but also one of the scary things, is that you never know what people are going to say. So you can stand up in front of a room like this and think you're totally prepared, and someone will throw you a curveball and you've got no idea how to deal with it. But as hard as those curveballs are to deal with, and as frustrating as it is when all your preparation suddenly goes out the window by the student who's totally engaged in the topic and knows it, perhaps even, maybe nuances of it, perhaps even better than you do. One of the great things about that is that when I go home and I'm sitting on the tube on the way home, is that they're the things that I think about the most. They're the students' questions that make me question my own ideas and my own ideals. And I think the lesson that I personally take from that is that you can never stop learning, and you can never stop questioning your beliefs or your interpretations of an event. And why do you think I started that? What does that tell us about Iraq? Well, I think it tells us a lot about Iraq and a lot about Britain's engagement with Iraq, a lot about with the West's as a kind of general rubrics engagement with Iraq, although of course we have to be careful about making too many generalisations. But obviously, if I said to you Iraq over the last decade, a lot of you would go, okay, yeah, Abu Ghraib, okay, yeah, Blackwater, and then maybe a few other scandals. But of course, Iraq is a country, as is Britain. There are millions of people live there. It's extremely diverse, and it's been affected in many ways, which don't necessarily always get reported. Not necessarily, it's not always the fault of the media, because obviously these events are complex, so how can they possibly report everything in the way that it has to be? But I think what we can learn from my experience of teaching is that events like this can teach you to maybe try and question what you think you know about Iraq, and it's certainly, I'm sure I will learn things in the next 2 hours as much as you will. So I guess that's what I think my teaching can tell, my experience of my teaching can tell us about Iraq. Obviously this is quite a poignant day, depending on where you draw the line, the date line, either it was yesterday or today. It's the 10th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, and of course there are a myriad of opinions surrounding that. But those opinions, I think, can sometimes take away from some of the nuances of the actual debate. I don't know how many of you are aware of Iraq Body Count. It's a website which essentially counts the number of civilian deaths in Iraq over the last decade, and it doesn't have any kind of ethnic or religious agenda. It literally just goes through and documents as well as it can how many deaths have been, and because it's quite open about its methodology, it admits that there's some disparity in it. So I've just checked it today. So according to Iraq Body Count, somewhere between 111,827 and 122,306 civilians have died as a result of, first, obviously, the coalition's engagement in Iraq, but now, obviously, with relation to the continued conflicts that continue to happen in Iraq and the different variations on that. So I think it's very important that we continue to try and learn the lessons of Iraq, and hopefully this next couple of hours will enable us to do so. On the panel, we've got some really, really interesting people with some very, very distinct perspectives on Iraq. So I think hopefully we can all learn something from them. Just to my left here, we've got David Benest OBE, who was a long-time member of the British military. He has written extensively about British counterinsurgency policy and engagement in different conflicts over the last 100 years. So David is not necessarily going to be focusing too much on Iraq in his initial speech, but he's going to be talking about perhaps how Iraq fits into Britain's long-term counterinsurgency policy, which I think is really, really important to understand how the British state, how its policies manifest, and how it may well alter in the future. So David's going to speak around that. To the left of David is Sabah Al-Mukhtar. Sabah Al-Mukhtar is a prominent Iraqi lawyer. He has been in Britain since 1980, is that right?
Much earlier.
Much earlier, okay, oh, I apologise, right, mind that right, see? No preparation. Okay, so, and he has been involved in high-level cases involving things such as the Lockerbie trial, Abu Hamza, and involving clients such as Kuwaiti Airways versus Iraqi Airways. And he's going to talk about the effect of the conflict on Iraqi society itself. So it's a very, very different perspective to David's, but again, very, very valid. And then to my far left, we've got Ian Cobain, who writes for The Guardian. Those of you who are my students have heard me banging on about this book already, but if you're not my student, then please go and look up David's recent book. It's called Cruel Britannia, and I think the subheading is The Secret History of Torture. Is that? Yeah. It really is a really great, it's a fantastic book. The subject matter isn't fantastic, obviously, but it's a very, very well written, very, very informative read. So please go and search it out if you've not come across it yet. I'm sure all my students have done. So I guess without further ado, I will pass on. I guess if we start on the left and move down the column. So are you okay to speak first? Yeah, David? Me. Yeah, okay, all right then. So it's David Benest.
Okay, well, it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I came up with this from the point of view specifically of the British and our record in counterinsurgency. But it begins in Iraq over the Sabah Al-Mukhtar inquiry and, of course, now the Danny Boy inquiry. It starts also with The Guardian, in that on the 25th November 2011 an article appeared about a British serving officer, a lawyer, who was effectively told to shut up about allegations regarding misbehaviour of troops in Iraq. And he subsequently resigned. He's now a priest. There are, as far as I know, and I may be corrected here, about 222 allegations against British forces in Iraq between 2003 and 2009. The Joint Forward Intelligence Team is under investigation, has been for some time. The Iraq Historical Allegations Team has been operating for some time. Brigadier Robert Aitken provided something called the Aitken Report, investigating whether it was a case of rotten apples in the barrel or something wrong with our command climate that allowed the incidents such as Sabah Al-Mukhtar to take place. Some people, some retired officers, have referred to these incidents as an example of our broken society, and in particular I would feature General Lord Dannatt, now retired. And you may have heard very similar statements from the Prime Minister, that because we have a broken society, that's why these incidents have occurred. You have another dimension in that General Sir Rupert Smith has written a book called The Utility of Force, claiming that wars among the people is a new paradigm in war. And that's why we're having these particular forms of misbehaviour, because we're not used to having to deal with civilians on the streets of Basra and so on. I would turn all that on its head and actually state that we have a long record of troops from time to time, and police and so on, and government misbehaving in counterinsurgency. I start in South Africa in 1900 with a certain gentleman called Kitchener, who, to try and resolve the issue of the Boer insurgency, which the Boer War had become, introduced internment without trial, in which some 320,000 people were detained, and about 51,000 died in the camps in South Africa. We burnt down 30,000 farms, and also 40 towns were destroyed. That particular scandal was brought to an end by two females, Emily Hobhouse and Dame Millicent Fawcett, to expose in Parliament in London what was going on behalf of the British public in South Africa. We have the similar situation in Ireland between 1916 and 21. Captain Bowen Colthurst, of particular infamy when he murdered in Portobello Barracks in Dublin a very prominent Irish nationalist, Sheehy Skeffington. And we have strategies at the highest level of government. I'm talking about the 2-for-1 strategy. For every member of the security forces killed, we were going to kill 2 members of the Irish Republican Army. We have incidents of torture, and in particular, one of our battalions here from London, the Essex Battalion, had its own torture squad. We have arson on a large scale with the Black and Tans, and in particular, Scottish regiments noted for their brutality against the civilians. We have a very similar situation in the Mandate of Palestine in the 30s, when the, what I would call the first Intifada developed. The use of hostages on top of vehicles and on trains, the destruction of villages, wholesale destruction of villages. In one village, the whole 14 civilians killed through having been denied food and water for several days. We have a doctrine called air control doctrine, which began in 1919 and continued right up to 1970. And this is the idea that you bomb civilians deliberately to force the end to conflict. And this is our friends in the Royal Air Force. This was done in particular in Oman in 1957 to 59 on Jebel Akhtar, where we wrecked the economy of the Jebel to bring that war to a close. We have leaders who specialised in this form of coercion, in particular a certain Arthur Harris, who perfected the style of bombing of civilians in Palestine in the 30s. And as far as I can see, in all that time, in 50 years, I'm only aware of one Royal Air Force officer in, would you believe, Mesopotamia, as was, who actually resigned his commission over what was going on, because we were bombing the towns in Mesopotamia in the 1920-22 insurgency as well. We have similar issues in Malaya, in, for example, December 1948, where the Scots Guards murdered some 24 Chinese Malay civilians. That was covered up, and the official historian for the Malaya campaign, Professor Anthony Short, is now making clear that he won't accept the government line on it. In Aden, we had something called Argyle Law in 1967. This was a certain style of leadership by Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mitchell, called tolerant toughness. In Kenya, the issues of Kenya have been well exposed and are being exposed at the moment. One Captain Griffiths murdering a suspect, and in fact, in his case, sentenced to 3 years in prison. Some 430 Kenyans shot whilst trying to run away. 92 Kenyans dying in custody. And then massacres at, for example, the Hola camp, where 11 Kenyans are murdered. And this is with the complicity of the government of our country in London. It was Enoch Powell, of all people, and Barbara Castle, who in the Houses of Commons actually said, if this is how we're going to run our country, we don't deserve to have an empire. And so it goes on in Kenya, that's under investigation. Did anyone resign about the treatment of Kenyan civilians? Yes. The head of police, Arthur Young, because he realised that if he didn't get out, he would probably himself have been murdered. In Northern Ireland, we have episodes of collusion between the police and the army from 1970 to 73, which in effect meant that anyone who, if any civilian was killed, it would not be investigated by the police at all. We had, of course, the 5 techniques under internment: sleep deprivation, stress positions, white noise, hooding, and food and water deprivation. Banned by the Heath government, and yet, as we will probably see in more detail in a moment, revived by our intelligence people to be used against internees in Iraq after 2003. We have lies regarding what took place on the 30th of January 1972, where soldiers from my regiment, the Parachute Regiment, openly, brazenly lied to a Lord Chief Justice as to what took place in Londonderry. And that has, of course, been uncovered by Lord Chief Justice Saville, and now the Bloody Sunday incident is a murder inquiry. And we have an incident we were discussing earlier of torture by waterboarding in West Belfast. There are some 200 cases of beatings in the interrogation centre at Castlereagh under investigation, and so on. So what am I saying here? Complicity, often at the very highest levels of government, is the reality, has been the reality over many, many decades, as well as what goes on at the lower level. I believe personally that where leadership is sound, these things should not occur and hopefully will not occur. We have an issue in our armed forces between the loyalty expected within a regiment and the moral courage that is required of people, especially officers, to stand out against this form of atrocity. But I'm optimistic, quietly. We have a far better educated armed force than we've ever had. 85% of officers in the army are graduates, like you here. We have an era, which we're talking about at this conference, of human rights, very well known across the world, and that is why a lot of these incidents are being exposed. And of course we have, and we've got one here, 24/7 media. So are we reflecting on some form of broken society in UK 2013? I do not believe that to be the case. As I said, I am quietly optimistic. So that's really the background where I come from in terms of what I think we're now going to focus on in greater detail.
Okay, so some very sobering words, but certainly quite optimistic. So thank you very much. Ian, do you mind just moving up chairs, and then Sabah,
Good afternoon. I feel privileged to be talking to you. I have children who are probably your age, and they stop listening to me. So when I find somebody listening, I'm really privileged. Iraq. I'm being asked to talk about what is the situation in Iraq, how does it feel after 10 years. But I think we need to just touch for a few minutes on some of the earlier issues. In the first instance, we are told that the war in Iraq was to get rid of Saddam Hussein, to put democracy, there was weapons of mass destruction, there was the linkage between the regime and Al-Qaeda, there was the involvement in 11 September, and all these reasons. I would like to suggest to you that really this is just not true. The reason is this. The USA began to want to change the regime in Iraq in 2001. 2001, the USA produced a legislation, a law, which is called the Liberation of Iraq Act. It's that one on the 30th, sorry, I meant 98. In the year 1998, on the 31st of October, the USA produced the legislation which is called the Iraq Liberation Act. Article 3 of that act says that the policy of the United States is to support efforts to remove the regime headed by Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq and to replace that regime. This is before the 11th September, this is before the weapons of mass destruction, this is before Al-Qaeda, this is before all these things. This, in fact, this act itself empowers the President of the USA to provide military and financial support to that aim. In addition, additionally, to provide radio and television facilities. The US actually used all these measures and more. Of course, this act is in fact contrary to Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which says all member states shall refrain from the threat of use of force against the territories or political independence of any state. This was done in 1998. In 1998. The second thing which I would like you to remember is that in 1999, that is before all these events, the USA began actually to plan to change the regime in Iraq. Once the act was made, the State Department, as well as the Defense Department, in fact set up what was called the Future for Iraq Project, FIP. This was run by a man called Thomas Warwick. What they have done is that they gathered around 250 people. Mostly were Iraqis, either Iraqis in exile or Iraqis naturalized or whatever, but there were 250 people from various disciplines, doctors, lawyers, diplomats, businessmen, everything. Those people, they made them into a 16 working group. These 16 working group began to design how to dismantle Iraq. This is in January 1999. So the dissolution of the army, the change of the constitution, the revision of the oil scene, all these issues, they began. Even they even planned the health situation in the aftermath. That same group, which was the Future for Iraq project, subsequently was converted into what was called the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. Note, the USA always works with humanitarian issues. So it's called ORHA. And this one was actually in charge of the running of Iraq in the form of what was called the Coalition Provisional Authority, which is the CPA. The Coalition Provisional Authority ran Iraq for a number of years under Ambassador Bremer, who is a US diplomat. He was the most powerful person in the history of Iraq. If you combine the power which the British political resident had in Iraq pre-independence, you add to that the powers that the king of Iraq had, and you add to that what the other leaders, including Saddam Hussein, you find Bremer had more power than all of them put together. Because in fact, the CPA says that he has the power of the legislature, the judicial, and the administrative authorities. All states have these three arms. He was in charge of all of them. Now, if one looks at the Hague regulations says that occupying forces shall respect. No, I think I'm going one. The occupying force will be respecting the rules of the country unless absolutely prevented the laws in force in the country. Article 54 of the Fourth Geneva Convention says that the occupying power may not alter the status of public officials or judges in the occupied territories, etc., etc. The idea is that wars are something bad, but if you're going to have a war, you still need to have some regulations. That's why we had the Hague regulations, we had the Geneva Conventions with all its attachments. The UN Security Council Resolution 1511, it actually says that everything that the Coalition Provisional Authority will do in Iraq shall be of a temporary nature. Ambassador Bremer issued 100 orders, 16 memoranda, and 12 regulations, which really redrew everything in Iraq. He didn't just change a law. He changed everything. Had a new constitution, they've changed the economy of the country, they've changed the oil industry, they've dismantled the state, they've dissolved the army, they've created the legislations which affect people's rights. So for instance, we're talking about going into Iraq for democracy and freedom and rule of law, and then at the same time, you produce a law which says that people who have a particular political view shall be banned and shall be penalized, which is called the de-Baathification law. And it doesn't matter what anybody think about the Ba'athist or any other regime. This is talking about people who have a view, a political view. It's not talking about people who committed a crime based on that one. It's talking about people who have this view. Now, these regulations were not, and laws and memoranda, they were not of a temporary nature. Until today, the effect of these are on Iraq. Because I have limitation of time, I think what I'm going to say is to talk quickly now about the situation in Iraq. I'm sure everybody sometimes hears on the news. If you follow the news which is not the mainstream British news, you will find out what's happening. But generally speaking, Western media, whether it's the CNNs or the BBCs or whatever they are, ITVs and all of them, whether they are satellite or terrestrial, they don't cover these issues because we have lots of issues. You know, debate in Parliament, it has precedent over something else. Every country does that. But news on Iraq are not really available on the Western media, but it's available on other means. But it requires people to have satellite and to know the language, and etc., etc. The situation in Iraq, there are daily killings. There are daily killings. There are almost 500 people killed every single month. This is when the situation is not bad. There was a time where there were something like 120 people killed per day. Now, this gives you an indication of the number of people who were killed. The problem with this one, this is the basic, the fundamental human right, and that is the right to life. We talk about freedoms and we talk about all sorts of human rights and political parties and what have you. But first of all, people have to survive. And the state has a duty to protect the life of the people as a basic, as the most fundamental. And then after that, we get into the right to education and health and child. At the present moment, Iraq, the points which you have on the screen, these are taken from the UN reports. There is a special unit within the UN Human Rights Council called UNAMI, United Nations something for Iraq. This one produces regular reports, and you can see it's all available. All these items that I have listed there, that's the arbitrary detention, the death penalty, the anti-terror law, the disappearances, the torture. Aside from the British and the US, I've added them so that we can just allude to them. But at the present moment, we have a situation where the legislation are bad. You have an anti-terror law in Iraq, which has Article 4 in it that says anybody who commits an act of terrorism will be sentenced to death, which is not too different from many other countries. But it goes on to say, and anybody who participates, anybody who finances, anybody who calls for it, anybody who encourages it, will also be sentenced to death. But the law does not define what does it mean that you actually encourage it. So if I make a speech and I say that people should kill each other, I get penalized by death for just saying that. And this is really way too far. But the crazy thing in the situation, and this is where the second part of it comes in, the legislation, I've said it's bad, but the second part is the judiciary is bad. Paragraph 2 of this same article says, anybody who knows of a terror act that is likely to happen, it doesn't matter whether it happened or not, that person shall be sentenced for life imprisonment. 5 months ago, the Prime Minister of Iraq, the current Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, has come out to say that he knows for the last 3 years that the Vice President, his name is Hashimi, that he is a terrorist. So you have a person who have known of a terrorist for the last 3 years, but hasn't said anything. And paragraph 2 actually says that person should be imprisoned for life. But the courts are not working like this. So you have a situation where you have bad legislation, you have bad judiciary, and then you have bad practices. There was in Iraq armies and police and security services and everything. The occupation of Iraq dismantled the state. They literally dismissed all of the law enforcement agencies, the army and the police and what have you, including traffic policemen. You know, how could you just dismiss traffic policemen? Who's going to run the show? Then subsequently they gathered people and they made them into police and army. They all wear the same uniform. But in fact, they don't have a national allegiance like wherever you have in the world. They have allegiance either to a sect or to a religion or to an ethnicity or to some leader or some tribe, or indeed some of them are on the invasion of Iraq, just a week before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the prison population of Iraq, the criminal prison population of Iraq was 15,000, almost 15,000 criminals, who were rapists and thieves and all sorts of ordinary criminals. Those people were all let out of the prison just before the bombing, because if you keep them there, they're going to die because nobody is going to be there, neither to feed them or do anything, and they could be. So they just let them out. So suddenly you put back into the society 15,000 criminals. And those are convicted criminals. Then you have a ruler, Mr. Bremer, and before him there was a Garner, and Professor Jawad here. He met Garner. He's Professor of Political Science, and welcome, Dr. Jawad. And he was Professor of Political Science in Baghdad University. He met Garner. Those people, they didn't have an idea where they are. And suddenly, you have to ask them, those people, to decide how you run the country when they don't understand the language, they don't understand the people, they don't have any idea. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on this one, but I would like to say that there are people who are being detained in Iraq, and they are in tens of thousands. We don't have any figures who are arbitrarily detained. They are detained by the police. They are tortured. They make them sign confessions. Then after that, they have a summary appearance before a judge, and they have to confirm to him that they have signed these confessions. And after a few days, you have a trial, and they are found to be, everybody now, almost everybody is being arrested under Article 4 of the Anti-Terrorist Act. So even the ministers of the government, it doesn't matter what, you know, they are part of the system, it doesn't matter, you have political differences, but even ministers are now being accused by the government of being terrorists. So everybody is being, the most recent one is the Minister of Finance. I think 2 weeks ago there was an arrest warrant for him as under Article 4 of the Anti-Terror Act. You have people who are being put to death. Iraq has now the highest number of hanging in the world. And the UN have asked repeatedly that at least there should be a stoppage of this until something happens. You have people disappearing in Iraq. You have torture. We have the situation of the torture by the British and the US Army. At least in Britain here, we have looked at some of the issues. There is the Bahamous and there are some other cases that Britain has at least looked at it. We have had 3 inquiries into the conduct of Iraq, and we are still waiting for the Chilcot one. The Chilcot inquiry, shows you how the politics is still not being honest. When the government decided to have the Chilcot inquiry, it is one of the first times that you give a commission to produce a report, but not before a particular date, because they didn't want the report to come out before the election. And until now, 1.5 years later, and we are still waiting for the report. There is quite a lot of concern among the lawyers as to why is this delay, because they are trying to tweak it, etc. This is in Britain. In the USA, almost nobody was penalized for nothing. You had the Abu Ghraib, we've seen it. We know what people did. We know the names and units and what have you. They tried them, those who were tried, and at the end of the day, they are either not sufficient evidence, or they're found not guilty, or they reprimanded, or they deal with them on a military basis rather than giving them a proper sentence. So the US is still in a state of denial. The world, at the present moment these days, everybody is talking about the 10th anniversary. But watch for the signals. There is an attempt to actually say, well, it was, you know, the British government was fooled by 3 guys. It was on television yesterday, before yesterday. There are 3 chaps who were Iraqis who misled the government. So it's not the parliament, it's not Tony Blair, it's not Britain, it's, you know, all those 1.5 million people who went out in the street, they were stupid. They didn't know what they were doing. It's the government who knows that. And then it turns out they didn't know. It's those 3 guys. You have the USA held, also, even Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, he sat in the United Nations holding a thing about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and he knew everything, and the pipeline, and the pipes which came from Africa, aluminium pipes, and the yellow cake, and the whole thing. And then he writes in his memoirs, he said, I'm very saddened and very embarrassed that I was misled by our own people. Now, 1.5 million people have died. But this raises the question of the morality of the society. How come until now we don't have anybody who says, look, we made a mistake? Tony Blair was on television and he came out with a new concept which never existed before. And that is, he said, I have misled myself. Misleading is a concept when there is an outsider who misleads somebody. But for somebody to mislead himself, so he can't say that he was wrong. He cannot say what he's done is... Now, I think my time is nearly out, but I will just leave you with some questions. or some issues. That war is an upsided logic. We talked about liberation. Liberation usually is people being liberated from an outsider, but for an outsider to come and liberate the country from what? Its people? The idea of democracy is the rule of the majority and the responsibility of people. How can a foreign army bring democracy to a country? What, is it you buy a ton of democracy and you spread it among people, or what? Then you have the situation of what's called divide and rule, which is nothing new. It started with the Romans and everybody else did it. And that is when you divide the people, make them fight with each other, and then you begin to claim the victim. So everybody knows now. Why is Iraq in trouble? Because those Iraqis, they don't know what they are doing. The Shiites are killing the Sunnis and the Kurds are killing the Arabs. And so it's nothing to do with anybody. It's them, they are doing it. I could talk about the trials which has taken place, where they were a disgrace. Saddam Hussein, when he was arrested, he was going to be tried under the Geneva Convention, under the international law. The State Department looked at it and they found, not because he's not a criminal, but they found that they can't actually have a proper trial with evidence. So they decided the best way to do is to give him to the Iraqis. Let the Iraqis do the trial. And I used to, every morning I used to sit on Sky Television and CNN talking with other lawyers about the trial. And the trials, these trials were, it was the fault of the Iraqis. They don't know how to run a court. It's not us. We're trying to help them. We're trying to advise them. Was it about Saddam? Everybody now, even the other day I was in the BBC, and the question was, after we had a debate with 120 people, the lady said to everybody, she said, do you think that Saddam, is Iraq better with Saddam or not? And I said to the public, I said, be careful. Every time somebody brings in Saddam, when we're talking about invading a country, is trying to mislead you thinking-wise. Not because he's not a criminal, not because, but nobody went there, aside from the USA and their Liberation Act. They talked about democracy and freedom and all the other things. Now, for us in Britain, our soldiers fight in defense of Queen and country. How could any of the politicians, and indeed the media, don't forget, we have all participated in different degrees. Those people were not, they didn't die in defense of Queen or country. There was the dodgy file, there was the weapons of mass destruction, but I think it is about time that we begin to understand what's happening in the world, and it's about time people who have done something wrong, they come clean. This is not for the past, but for the future. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sabah. And I will just have our last speaker now, which is Ian Cobain.
Thank you very much. I'll keep this quite brief because I'm quite keen on hearing some difficult questions from you. I'm quite like curveballs, you know, so I'll keep it brief. So I'm a journalist. I work for The Guardian. I've been a journalist for about 30 years. Currently I work on sort of longer term projects, you know, what people refer to as an investigative reporter. But I've done all sorts of work in the past. 22 years ago, I found myself on the Saudi-Kuwait border, and I watched British infantrymen taking in Iraqi prisoners. And then 12 years later, I found myself in Basra, as British forces were moving to Basra, and I saw British forces taking in Iraqi prisoners. And there was a profound difference between what I saw on those two occasions. In 1991, what I was watching appeared to resemble a humanitarian operation. Things went wrong. I know that things went wrong occasionally, and people got hurt and got killed. But by and large, what these British troops were doing, they were from a British infantry battalion called the Staffordshire Regiment. And what they were doing was they were trying to calm these Iraqi soldiers down. They were trying to rehydrate them, they were trying to get some water inside them, they were getting them under shade as quickly as possible, calming them down and then moving them on. And in 2003, I was in the one of Saddam's palaces in Basra, just after they'd been taken by Royal Marines. And I walked around the corner, and there was this long row of Iraqi soldiers, kneeling upright, in the sunshine, with hoods over their heads. And I went away, and I came back a little while later, and they're all there, still there, in the same position. And then a British Army medic sort of sidled up to me and explained that they had been just been asked to go and revive somebody, an Iraqi who was being interrogated. And they described going into this room, and they said that it was dark, and they didn't mean there was no light. They meant it was morally a dark place. It smelt of shit, piss, and vomit. And one of the prisoners there had passed out. And this medic was asked to revive them. So there was this huge difference between the two ways in which prisoners were being taken. Now, reporters like me, we're people who, we ask a lot of questions and we try and tease out a few facts. And then we try and make sense of those facts. And I find increasingly that's the tricky bit sometimes. And then we sort of mould the facts into a story and pass it on. We tell stories. I didn't understand what I saw. And frankly, I was too busy to pay too much attention. I had to move and go to places and other things to report on. Years later, I found that I was increasingly being asked to make some inquiries about some of the darker aspects of Britain's counter-terrorism operations after 9/11 and 7/7, and the way in which we'd offered support for the US rendition programme, and the way in which we'd become very closely involved in the torture, including torture of British citizens in Pakistan, principally, but other places as well, Bangladesh, Egypt. And this work led eventually to the book, which you mentioned, but after a while, a couple of lawyers approached me and said, well, why are you so concerned about British complicity in torture, British colluding and getting close to torture? Why don't you look at what we've been doing in Iraq, where you will find that the British haven't been colluding in torture, the British have actually been actively themselves torturing prisoners. And so I started trying to make what inquiries I could, and I found that to an extent they were right. There was significant numbers of Iraqis who had been detained and who all gave very similar accounts of their mistreatment. They said that they were knocked about on arrival, on detention at their home. Usually they would be knocked about again while being transported to a place of detention. They would then be examined by a doctor, a military doctor, who wouldn't take any interest in their injuries, but would test their breathing, their body temperature, their heart rate, would sampling their urine, asking about allergies, but didn't care that they had a broken nose or covered in bruises. And then they would be interrogated. And it seemed to me that they were operating according to the policy. So I started making what inquiries I could, and I found that not only were they operating to the policy, but the individuals who were conducting the interrogations had been trained to do so in this manner. A lot of them being trained in Bedfordshire. And they were acting according to, that this was an integral part of the doctrine of this particular military unit that was conducting these interrogations. And that other units were conducting themselves in a similar way. So we've seen on a slide here references to British torture in Iraq. It sounds strong, it sounds harsh, but it is what has happened to an extent. It's not the whole picture, thankfully, but it is what has happened. And I think it's very important that we should recognise that that's what has happened, and that we should find out as much as we possibly can about it. And that whenever people lie to us, whenever our political leaders say we don't collude in torture, we don't encourage, we don't participate in it, that we should marshal as much evidence as we can to show that those claims are false, that we're being lied to. So, and we can't undo the torture, but maybe we can make it a little more difficult in future for ministers to lie to us that way.
Okay, great. So, three really interesting talks. Thank you very much. I guess I'll just take questions from the floor now. Anyone want to volunteer? Yeah, Nash?
No, I get to start with my statement, and I think I'm not asking any question because what Mr. Sabah just saying was not new. I know his view in Arabic.
Do you want to speak up?
I know Mr. Sabah from his view from Arabic National Congress, Nationalist Congress, who is represented. So Mr. Sabah's ideology and thinking is not new for Iraqis to be recognized. He's fundamentally nationalist Arabic. He's a favor of Saddam Hussein. So I'm just going to go briefly for what happened. I mean, you just mentioned there's 111,000 people that's being killed after 10 years. In 1987 to 1988, in 8 months, Saddam Hussein killed 182,000 civilian individuals, no armed women and children, in the name of Anfal 1 till Anfal 8. In 1982, Saddam Hussein killed 8,000 of members of family of President Barzani. In Halabja, 16 March 1988, Saddam Hussein killed 5,000 women and children, who Mr. Sabah has a doubt about that Saddam who used that chemical weapon. In one of his interview in 9/1/2006, when was one journalist in Tunisia, and also published it in one of the very Ba'ath Party websites called Shabakat Basra, who is representing the Ba'ath Party in ideas. So he has a doubt about this chemical weapon having by Saddam Hussein, and also he has a doubt about the number of civilians have been killed. So if he has a doubt about Saddam Hussein's killing of civilians,
this shouldn't be an attack on people.
No, it's not. No, he just.
Do you want to ask a question
I'm sorry,
rather than attacking someone?
No, it's not. It's not attack. He has a time to talk about his view. Let me talk about my view either. It is not. It's a two-way.
Right. Okay. Just one more minute.
Yeah.
And then
No.
we'll move on,
I'm sorry. It is. He's crying for a Bremer kid, the army and traffic orders out. Yes, they did, because even the traffic orders has to be Ba'ath Party, member of a Ba'ath Party to get the job. Of course, you have to clean this ideology of Ba'ath Party in the system.
Okay.
Questions?
Nash, I think. Do you know what, Nash? Can we stop there? And I think we
but the
should
democracy.
give Sabah
He's
a
talking
chance
about
to respond
democracy.
to
No, 55 years, one party, one guy run the country. There were 3 newspapers. Today in Iraq, there's 1,500 newspapers, including all the views from the right to left to the left.
No, he's right.
Yeah, there's 1,000 television right now in Iraq. So there's no doubt you could compare.
Nash, just calm down.
No,
right?
you cannot compare.
Nash, can I just say
All
that
Iraqi money.
Nash, let me speak, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so no one, I think, in this room, right, is defending anything that Saddam Hussein did, right? Certainly not me, as far as I'm aware, certainly not anyone on the panel.
Yeah, but
although
people have to...
Nash, right?
Yeah.
Shush, yeah? I think we've got your point, yeah? Thank you very much for making it. But there's like a lot of people in the room. I understand you're very passionate, and maybe you can speak, if you want to bring the point out later in more detail, that's great, but there's like a lot of people.
Okay, I'll come back.
But it's okay. Can I just give Sabah a chance to respond, and then we'll move on to more questions?
I don't think we need to respond.
No. All right. But right, this young lady here, and then Natalie, and then we'll go
Well,
to
the
the
question to be asked is, you talked about all the negative things that happened. What was positive for the Iraqis? Don't tell me there's no positives,
No,
because...
I will tell you what the
you know.
positive is. First of all, they have mobile telephones.
Come on, be realistic.
Sorry, I'm being realistic.
Yes.
I'm being realistic.
Okay.
If you listen, you will find out.
Okay, I'll go ahead.
If you do the objective testing, every item with every item, check education with education, health with health, security with security. If you check any of these things, you find the situation now is worse. Except...
It's not true.
Wait, let him finish.
No, it's not true.
Well, understand
No,
the
I
reality.
have the numbers. He's wrong. He cannot dismount people. I have the numbers. How many universities opened after the Saddam Hussein?
Freedom of speech. He's allowed to speak without you interrupting him.
Yeah, it is, I'm allowed.
You certainly are, yeah.
Yeah, let him speak.
So as I said, there are newspapers, there are television stations, there are radios, and there are mobile telephones, and there is no government, and there is no control of the thing, and you have a parliament which cannot even agree on things because of the divisions among them, and it is not political. It is allegiance of people. So if you are, and this is the only country where people change from one side to the other during the life of the parliament. They have produced more legislations for the benefit of the members of parliament, salaries and securities and etc., than anything else for the Iraqi people. I think I'll stop here.
So, wait, so your solution would be basically creating another Saddam and putting everyone in one place?
Exactly.
Please.
That would be your solution?
Questions?
Because Saddam suddenly was great.
Okay, all right.
Right.
I think we should just move, right, we'll move on to Nasli and then the gentleman at the back there.
Right, I'd like us to focus on the contemporary context that exists right now. So why don't we talk about Maliki's regime and how that is now very authoritarian in form, okay, and the fact that torture is on a rise, detentions, illegal detentions are on a rise, and you have a constitution that cannot be implemented and was written by a circle of people that were appointed by Bremer. I want to talk about how, I guess, the law can be revised or reformed, because until that occurs, then justice will not be served, and you will still have not only a polarised society, but a polarised government and certain ministries operating independently, and people who have localised power, and everyone just kind of fighting, as we saw yesterday, 65 people killed. So instead of looking at the past and, okay, like I agree with you, I don't think anyone is defending Saddam Hussein, but we shouldn't reduce Iraqi history to the caricature of Saddam Hussein, because every leader has committed various wrongs. So what is the solution at the moment for Iraqis? Is there going to be another civil war? What's going to be the outcome in the upcoming elections? Why have the local elections been postponed? So I guess.
I agree with your views, and I think I want to look forward rather than looking backward. Looking forward, I think at the present moment there is a political stalemate, because the government of Maliki doesn't have the support of the Kurdish group, doesn't have the support of the Iraqi group, and certainly even within his own group he doesn't have sufficient backing. So you have a government which is not in control. The star cabinet, the three ministries are not there. He doesn't have a minister of defense or interior. Parliament is not functioning. The only way is, I think, if Maliki somehow disappears, goes and leave, whatever, and some of the politicians begin to look at the national interest. So they don't look at it that we are Kurds, or we are Shiites, or we are from Al-Iraqi. If they begin, those politicians, but unfortunately, we are reaching a point where we are trying to find the best of the worst. We have reached the point where everybody is so bad that you have to find a solution. But I think there is the current uprising, which is taking place in Iraq. The Kurdish movement is supporting them, not because they want to support them, but because to put pressure on Maliki. This uprising, the Maliki cannot get rid of it. So it is gaining grounds. There is a little more pressure now on the regime in Iraq, both from the Americans and the Europeans. European Parliament cancelled the meeting recently, I think it was 2-3 weeks ago, because they are worried about the situation, the way it is being run in the country. The Human Rights Organization, I've just come back from Geneva, Human Rights Council, has so far issued more condemnations against Iraq than any other country, except Syria. So Syria is number one, Iraq is number two, with the criticism of everything, including the problems in Iraq. I think there is a way forward. That takes a lot of doing, but I think, unfortunately, and it hurts me to say that, I still think we haven't reached the bottom yet. We're still heading in that direction at the rate that the politicians are playing it.
Okay, all right, thank you. I said I'd go up here and then we'll go over to this side. Yeah.
Yeah, with all respect, Mr. Sabah, your speech was on point and meant a lot. A lot of people in this room are listening to what you said.
Do you want to speak up a bit?
You firstly said that whenever we come to talk about the problem of Iraq and the invasion of the British and Americans on Iraq, people speak it, look what Saddam done, look what Saddam done. This is not the point. The point is how they went on no authorization from anyone into invading this country. Second of all, I don't think this gentleman over here knows the meaning of treason. Anyone who collaborates with a country against another country in the time of war, that means treason. And their punishment is death. all this proof you